Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Work at Home Rockstar podcast. Very excited for today's episode. We are talking to the founder and CEO of Podcast Marketing Agency. And what they do is they help podcasters grow, market, and monetize their shows. So I'm excited to be rocking out today with Sarah St. John. Hey, Sarah, you ready to rock?
I'm ready to rock and roll.
Love it. So we always start off here in a good note. So tell me a story of success in your business that we can all be inspired by.
Yeah, so I would say a fairly recent one, probably about a year ago. Um, my podcast hit the top 100 in Apple Podcasts under entrepreneurship.
Wow.
So that was pretty exciting, and I've kind of tried to figure out how that happened and whatever. And I've done some speaking engagements on it on different tips to get to the top 100. So it's kind of um opened up some speaking opportunities as well.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Yeah, 'cause, it is a bit of a mystery. I mean, this is obviously a podcast, so I've kind of been watching things, and some episodes get lots of downloads, some of them don't, and you get, like, added in these new and noteworthy when you first get started, maybe, maybe not. Okay.
Yeah.
And nobody seems to know exactly why. It's bizarre, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, it's like they haven't really revealed exactly how to do it, and then they don't even notify you.
Mhm.
It's like you just have to stumble upon it your own, or like in my case, friends of mine, other podcast friends had noticed and they let me know. And so it's like, yeah.
Yeah, it's bizarre stuff. Well, I mean, and I guess, Google is similar too with the way that they run their algorithm. They don't tell you. They just sort of like I guess it makes sense because if they do tell you, then people tend to try to game that system, right? They sort of try to
Mm.
cheat and get their podcast higher. So if they don't tell you, then, chances are their organic algorithms will pick you up more, right? I
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, maybe that is why.
think it is. I've been around the digital marketing industry for a little while, and back, when I first got started, people used to use these article spinners. So you'd write one article, and then you'd create, umpteen versions of it based on just, and obviously you can't do that
Mm.
anymore. but
Mhm.
but back then, people used to try to cheat. So I think that's why, you know.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. But anyway, so along with the good notes, sometimes there's some things that don't go as planned. There's some bad notes that get hit. So tell me, is there something that like a mistake that you made along your path that we can learn from?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I had shiny object syndrome for well over a decade, um, and tried a bunch of different business models and had several different businesses. And I think not being focused
Mm,
on, trying to nail down one business or one business model and trying a bunch of different things like that just wasted time, energy, effort, money. Um, so I would say, generally speaking, that, but a specific example, not even really related to that, but a failure, I suppose, but kind of out of my control though, is before I got into podcasting, well, I was kind of doing podcasting, but I didn't have a podcast business, but I had an online travel agency, but then COVID happened. And so all my bookings got canceled and you don't get paid until the person completes their trip. So like a bunch of work that then I didn't end up getting paid for. So I ended up closing or stopping that business because I was like it just seemed too volatile with you just never know like what
mm.
could happen, a global pandemic or maybe some like safety or security issue that could happen and affect travel or whatever. And so I guess that would be a failure in a way, but kind of like, I mean, I could have stuck with it, I suppose, but who knew how long it was going to take for, people to start traveling again. So yeah, I just closed shop, but I'm glad I did because then it gave me more time to focus on podcasting and all of that. And then launch a podcast business and all of that kind of stuff. So I think in the end it worked out and was probably the right decision, but yeah.
Yeah, it seems like the good notes and the bad notes are always, like, intermingled, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
sometimes the good ones can turn into I mean, sometimes the bad ones can turn into good because, like, they're not maybe good at the time,
Mhm.
but then when you are a year or something, out from it, you can maybe look back and see why that happened.
Yep. Yeah, well, they always do say that you don't really learn from the successes, you learn from the
Mm.
failures, and that's
Mm.
kind of the point, right?
Yeah, that is a good point.
Yeah, and I just like, that's why I like to talk about the bad note on the show so often is 'cause it is one of those things where people sort of try to avoid failing, but if you avoid failing, you're probably not doing anything, first of all, right?
Oh, true.
Right, and so you're probably standing still, but also, if you hear from all these people that have, successful businesses that are, meeting the needs that they want, and they all have a failure to talk about. Every one of them,
Mhm.
right? So, it is one of those things where, we have to normalize that failure, right?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, and yeah, how can you learn and grow and improve if you don't fail, really?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think, that's one of those things where if you just happen to get lucky and you get the success right out of the gate, it tends to not really last very long, right?
Mm.
Something weird happens, and all of a sudden you're at square zero, and then you don't know how to get back up because
Mm.
you didn't actually do anything the first time. You just got lucky. Maybe you bought in at the right time or whatever it happens to be, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Wow.
So, I'm wondering, let's talk about a little bit about fans. So, you know, the the podcast industry is a great example because, anybody can start a podcast. Anybody. You just have to have a computer, probably. No,
Mhm.
you don't even have to have a computer. You have to have a phone, I think, a camera,
Right.
and boom, you're done. You're in business. You've got your podcast. But, there's a difference between putting the podcast out there and then getting a bunch of fans to your podcast. So I'm wondering,
Mhm.
how would you go about maybe getting fans? How did you go about it the first time? And then would you do anything differently now?
Yeah, so I think one thing I recommend is being on platforms that podcast platforms that have kind of a social component like Good Pods or Podvine. There's some others where you actually get to communicate with listeners.
Hmm,
Where I mean, of course, you should be on Apple and Spotify and all those as well. Um, but it's nice to be on platforms where you can actually communicate with listeners. And I guess even YouTube though, if you have a video podcast and you put it on YouTube, you can communicate that way. Um, so that would be one thing. And then of course, posting on social media. But to me, posting your podcast on social media is not necessarily too likely that someone's gonna click over and listen to your podcast, but it's more of an awareness thing.
okay,
Like people know about your podcast or find out about it. They might not actually like go to a podcast app and listen to it from social media, but they might at least see your little clips or whatever. Um and then there's various like newsletters and blogs and other podcasts that you can get in. You could do like pod swaps with someone, like be on their show and then have them on your show
mm,
and kind of cross promote. Or you could, um, even if, regardless of whether you have your own podcast or not, I definitely recommend podcast guesting. But even as a podcast host, I recommend that as well because then obviously you're reaching podcast listeners. So if they're listening to the show that you're a guest on, they're more likely to, like, check out your show than maybe, a social media post or something like that, where that those people might not even be podcast listeners. Um, and then there are, like, paid methods, like, on podcast player ads and directories where you can And if you're gonna run ads, I recommend doing them in a podcast player versus, like, social media because
Okay.
yeah, like, some of the podcast players, they have, or apps or, um, platforms, they have options to run ads. Some are more expensive than others. I usually do the really affordable ones that are, like, 100 or less to
Mhm.
run, a campaign. But that's a good way as well, kind of like guesting on another show, but you might reach more people that way. So those are just, a few different ways of kind of like, uh, you know, hopefully people finding you or learning about you and your podcast and hopefully listening and subscribing and
Hmm.
following.
Yeah, I like it. Those are really good tips. First of all, I didn't even know that there are social podcast apps. That's kinda cool. I'm gonna check that out myself. Uh,
Yeah.
right? But your idea about the ads is really good too, because I think that social media, like, I mean, I've been using social media to try to promote my podcast. I don't find it gets a whole lot of, traction, and I can see why, because I don't really find podcasts through social media myself. What I do is I go into my player, and if I'm playing a podcast, you're right, you sort of see related podcasts and, "Oh,
Mhm.
okay," then you click there. So that does make sense because you're already on the platform where you're listening to a podcast, you're probably more likely to hit people who are interested in podcasts in the platform that they listen to podcasts in, right? That makes sense to
Yeah.
me, whereas in social media, they're probably not looking for a podcast. I think that's a great place to put your clips, because they watch your clip and then they probably won't go to your podcast. They'll just watch the clip and go to the next clip because that's what
Yeah,
platforms do,
exactly.
right?
Right.
Right on. That's cool. Those are really, really good. So now let's talk a little bit about instruments and about tools that you use. So you must have a set of tools that you use to get success in your business. What are those?
Yeah, and they're mainly like software tools. Like for example, when I edit a podcast, I use Descript.
Me too.
Yeah, oh, you do? Yeah, I
Mhm.
love Descript. And then like, for like video clips for social, I've used a few platforms, but right now I'm using Minvo
Oh,
because they had an AppSumo deal. I Are you familiar with AppSumo?
nope.
Oh no. Okay.
I use Opus Clip.
Oh, okay, yeah. So AppSumo, it's like this marketplace for various software for entrepreneurs that offer like lifetime deals. So, I was using Vizard.ai, I think, and some others for like my clips, but that was like a monthly fee. But
Mhm.
then Menvo does the same thing, and they were on their, I think it was like a $59 lifetime deal. Um, so I use that now. And then let's see what else. I was using SendFox for email, but I might switch to ConvertKit because they just now are offering a free plan up to 10,000 subscribers. I'm all about, well, and I think we'll get into that later, but
Hmm.
using free software where I can.
Yeah.
Let's see, what else do I use? I should pull up uh I have like a list of things I use. Um, Hold on. Okay, let's see. I also use for like, being a guest on other shows or having guests on your show, like finding those people, Podmatch, which I is probably where we met
Yeah.
actually.
That's where we met. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. And then for my calendar, I use TidyCal, which is actually an AppSumo product, but it's like Calendly, but
Mhm.
it's a one-time fee, so it's um more affordable. And then, like, for my websites, landing pages, sales funnels, all that stuff, I use a platform called System.io. It's
Okay.
Systeme.io. Um, yeah, so, let's see what and Cast Magic for, like, show notes and transcripts. They actually also had a deal on AppSumo, but they don't anymore. But, yeah, so a lot of podcast related softwares that kinda help automate different, things along the way.
Wow. Well, I'm gonna check all those out 'cause, I'm using more paid
Oh,
things,
yeah.
yeah. But that's the thing is that there's a lot of free, I find that sometimes the free software, their upgrade to the like, their first level paid usually is pretty sweet, right?
Mm,
They obviously are getting a lot of people using the platform and probably get an opportunity to work out the bugs with all that stuff, and then their first level of paid, versions are usually pretty sweet too, so, that's, obviously an option too, right?
mhm, yeah, definitely. I recommend that.
Awesome. So, I mean, that kinda leads perfectly into the next topic, which is keeping the hat full, the cash flow. So, obviously, you've got that figured out if you're using lots of free versions of stuff, right?
Yeah, and so, of course, keeping the cash flow, we do wanna make more money, but I think kind of to incorporate saving more money, I mean, the more money you save, the more money you're really, I guess,
Making.
making or
Mhm,
yeah. And so for me, I use a lot of free software or like the free plan anyway on the software, or I'll do the lifetime deals. I check AppSumo every day for their latest deals, and then if it's something that I could use, or like say I'm using some other software, but now this software would replace that one for a lifetime deal, um, then I'll do that. So I do a lot of that. And then um, I mean, really the only things I mean, I pay for Descript, which is like 15 bucks a month.
mhm.
They do have a free plan, but it won't really get you
No, it
very
doesn't do
far.
enough. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, let's see, and then, of course, podcast hosting, I use Captivate. And then everything else, I think I either use something that's free or I've already paid for, like, a one-time deal where it's like, 50 bucks one time, maybe as much as 100. Um So I don't have recurring monthly
Wow,
expenses.
good for you.
Yeah. Well, and that's kinda how I got the idea of, so my podcast is called Frugalpreneur, which is about building a business on a bootstrap budget, and kinda how I got I originally was a book and then I did a podcast, but the idea came from the fact that I was, trying different online business models and discovered all these free or affordable software programs or tools or resources to like run an online business anyway for under 100 a month. Um, and yeah, I've
Wow.
been able to consistently do that under 100 a month in terms of like software.
Yeah,
Like if you're running ads and stuff, that's a whole other thing. Um, but yeah, software wise, definitely under 100 a month. Um, and so yeah, I just feel like the The less we have to spend on software and, just operations and all of that, um, the more money we can,
yeah,
you know,
make.
pocket. Yeah.
Yeah, and I will say that, for using, Descript, like, to edit your podcast, it's pretty, I mean, I wouldn't say it's accessible to anybody. But, on the other hand, you don't have to be like a super audio engineer in order to use it, whereas about like, 'cause when I started my podcast in 2015, it was actually very difficult. I was explaining to my son about it just yesterday, how back then, if I wanted to take a piece and cut out like an or something like that, you had to, like, go into the WAV file and go select the WAV file and delete it, and you had to zoom right in because you couldn't
Oh,
get any of the other
yeah.
words around it, and it was actually a lot of time. And now with
Yeah.
Descript, you just delete the ums, right? And it's
Yeah.
gone, right? Like, so things have really gotten a lot easier to use in terms of tools. It still is, a little bit time consuming, but that's the thing. Depending on where you're at in your business, if you aren't making a whole lot of money, well, then time is all you got.
Mhm.
However, once you start to grow your business, well, then maybe you get to a point where you can like hire a team to start to do that stuff. But you can definitely get off the ground right now with just spending your time, right?
Yeah, I definitely recommend that starting out. And yeah, for people who are kinda confused on the Descript thing, so it's like the way it works is you bring in your audio or video file and it creates a transcript and you can edit the transcript,
Mhm.
which will edit the audio and video. So like you in a click of a button, you can remove filler words like ums and uhs. Uh, I just did one right there.
Yep. I'm probably gonna leave it in though because I find that the ums and ahs are sort of useful in most conversations. I found
Mm,
it's like super robotic if you take them all out, but it is
yeah.
good to take them out for your clips. Yeah.
Oh, that's true.
Mm.
Yeah, and there's like a whole bunch of other stuff you can do in Descript. Um, so it's just it's easier and to me it's easier because you're editing the audio based on the transcript
Yeah,
and words versus like
a wave file.
oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Things have definitely come along quite a ways now. Now I'm wondering though, like, how do you make money from your podcast?
Yeah, well there's a few ways. I think the way that most people think of is sponsorship, which I
Hmm.
do make some money from occasional sponsorships. But the way that I do it is, like, I'll reach out to, software companies or other podcasts that would be relevant for my listeners, and work out a deal directly versus, like, the CPM model, which I think is cost per mille, which basically the industry standard, I think, ranges from, like, 15 to 25 bucks per 1,000 downloads.
Okay.
Um But if you work out a deal directly, you can usually work out a better deal than that. So that's one thing. Or you could use affiliate marketing. Like, say you have an author on your show, or well, you just have someone on your show that happened to have written a book. Um, you could link to that book, the Amazon link in your show notes, or say you do have someone on who does have software, or they have a course, or a coaching program, or anything. You could um, link to that in your show notes, maybe even work out a coupon code for your listeners so they're more inclined to uh, sign up under your link than,
Mm,
signing up directly. So yeah, so sponsorships, affiliates, and then of course, if you have your own product or service, um, that's really the best way to make money. Cause like sponsorships and affiliates, that's like, money here and there, and it's usually smaller amounts and whatever. But if you have say you have a coaching program or you have a course or something like that, and you had a podcast related to that kind of topic, whatever your program is on or your course, I mean, you're likely to make a lot more money
yeah.
y- promoting that. So yeah, and you could have merch, which I really don't recommend bothering with unless you're a huge podcast. Um, but yeah, there's several ways to monetize, but I would say that those are the most common, and the products and having your own product and service, that would definitely be
Yeah. Yeah, that's
the
for
best
me,
way.
that's mine. Yeah, I build
Mm.
websites and do
Oh,
branding and
okay.
stuff. So that's my main business, and then my podcast is really a way for me to get out there, meet people, connect with people that are likely to need a website. So
Mm.
yeah, so I'm basically following that that blueprint.
Yeah.
But I will say that it's been one of those things where when I started the podcast. Actually, when I started the podcast, that was the main reason. I thought, "Okay, I'm probably not gonna make any money on this podcast, but, I'll meet people that might be able to come into my business." But over time, you sort of start to get these emails from people going like, "Hey, you can monetize your podcast," all that kind of stuff.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it makes you think, "Oh, maybe I can make money directly from my podcast." But I think that, what you're saying, and you seem to be an expert in the area, that it's not super profitable for most people to be able to make money just from, sponsorship or like directly from the podcast. Cause I think you really do need a lot of downloads in order for that to actually, you know, um, pay off for you. But that being said, uh, the opposite side where we were just talking about if you're a coach or anything like that, you actually can, indirectly make money from a podcast that doesn't get a whole lot of downloads. you're actually meeting people and you're able to create content that you can consistently use in your social media, campaigns to actually, create some trust with people, right? So it can be profitable even though you're not technically making it directly from the podcast. Is that accurate the way I'm saying it?
Yeah, yeah, and it's kind of like if you get tens of thousands of downloads of, an episode, well, then, yeah, maybe
Mm,
sponsorship or even affiliate makes the most sense or could be profitable. But yeah, if you're getting like 1,000 downloads or 100 downloads even, um, per episode, having your own coaching program or, uh, course or something like that, um, would make more sense,
yeah.
and yeah, even if you just had 100 listeners, if your podcast and your audience is super niche down to, like, what you're
Selling.
co yeah, to what you're
Yeah.
selling, yeah.
Yeah.
Then, I mean, even if 10%, signed up for it or whatever, you could make a lot of money. So it's kind of
Yeah.
like maybe the podcast doesn't directly make money, like with a sponsorship situation, but indirectly through like, well, that's how people find you and learn about what you offer and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, the other like side benefit I think that I'll say is that you get really a lot better at speaking, like, at
Oh yeah.
talking to people, right? And I mean, that's a huge thing, especially considering like um making a sales call and talking about your actual business is a lot harder than having a casual conversation with a friend over the internet on a podcast, right? And but the bottom line of it is that sales really is just communicating. So the better you get at communicating, just generally, the better you're gonna get at sales indirectly. So it's kinda like one of those things where if you could start a podcast, and just get more familiar with either having a guest on or even just talking into a mic on your own, you're gonna improve your overall skill at having those conversations, which are super essential in building your business, right?
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think the more you do something, the better you get at it.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah,
mhm.
and this is one of those things where you're gonna get, that consistency of, I think that was probably one of the biggest things for me was having a weekly podcast for me was my way of being consistently thinking about
Uh,
business every week. I had to keep thinking about it, and I had to think about it multiple times. To think about it when I was doing the podcast, and I also had to think about it when I was editing the podcast, and then I had to think about it again when I was posting the podcast, right? So it's like one of those things where you've got this like regular thing in your calendar, and that doesn't necessarily have to be a weekly podcast. It could be a daily podcast. It could be a monthly podcast. It could be, a quarterly podcast. But whatever that consistency is, you kind of have to, or actually, that's a question. Is it better to be consistent on your podcast or can you just put one out when you get it ready?
oh, yeah, I would definitely be consistent. Well, and like when you're first launching a podcast, I recommend launching with anywhere from 3 to 10 episodes right out the gate at the
Hmm.
same time, just so people are more likely to binge it, get used to it, and wanna, and more likely to subscribe. But then consistently putting out, if you have a weekly show, which is what most people do. Um, some people do biweekly, some people do 2, 3, 5, 7 episodes a week, but that's very rare.
Mm,
So usually it's a weekly, and being consistent with putting it out every week, because otherwise people will forget about you or
yeah.
they'll be like, "Oh, this podcast hasn't put out anything in a month or something, so I'm just gonna unsubscribe," and, that kinda thing.
Yeah, if they don't see your episode pop in when they normally are supposed to see that episode, then they're gonna find something else, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So it's time for your guest solo. So tell me what's exciting in your business right now.
Yeah, so I just recently launched the podcast marketing agency, and yes, that is what it's called. I just figured it's good for SEO.
Yes, it is.
Um, and basically helping podcasters grow, market, and monetize their show, get more publicity, even PR. So that's what I'm doing now as far as my business goes. And then I also have my podcast, Frugalpreneur, which is 5 years old now and getting, around 250 episodes or so. And just loving the networking and connections, and I go to a lot of podcast conferences, and sometimes I speak at them, and I just I just love the community so much, so, um but yeah, so the podcast, it's in any app if you just search Frugalpreneur, or if you just go to frugal.show, that's the website,
Mhm.
and then the podcast marketing agency is podcastmarketing.agency.
That's awesome. Man, I was gonna say, how do we contact you? You got that right in there, didn't you?
Oh, yeah. Oh, and then also, actually, I launched a free online community, that, for, like, growing and monetizing and marketing your show, kinda just I have a couple of guest experts per month come on and
Mhm.
whatnot, and the link to that is ampmypod.com, ampmypod.com.
Cool. So is there a certain type of podcast or a certain type of person that would be, better suited to work with you?
Usually business podcasts. Um, Basically any kind of podcast where you are making money either directly or indirectly from your podcast, like it's part of your business model, versus say like a hobby podcast. Wouldn't really make sense to work with me because like if you're just doing the podcast for fun and not making money off of it, um, like it might make sense to join my free community,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mainly work with business podcasters.
I suppose unless they're really excited about spending money on their podcast that they're not making back.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there are some of those people out there.
Yeah, yeah, well, I mean, people spend money on hobbies. Hey, I'm a musician,
Yeah.
geez.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, true.
Right on. Cool. So, can you, just share your links one more time before we go?
Sure, so the podcast, you can go to frugal.show. The free community is ampmypod.com, and the podcast agency is podcastmarketing.agency.
Cool, and what's the best way to get in touch with you directly?
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm on all the socials at the Sarah St. John, Sarah with an H, and then Saint is ST. Um, because I guess at Sarah St. John was already taken, so I had to put the in front of it. Or you can just email me at sarah@ampmypod.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for rocking out with me today, Sarah. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. To the listeners, make sure you subscribe, rate, and comment, and we'll see you next time on the Work at Home Rockstar Podcast.